Hello, Beastcoast Pokemon fans, and welcome back to our channel where we're going to be breaking down two of the most recent events that have happened in the competitive Pokemon circuit. My name is Rosemary, and I'm here with Aaron and James, and we are grateful to PIXIO for sponsoring this video and allowing us to create this content for all of you to enjoy at home. You can check out all of their monitors and all of their supplies at PIXIOgaming.com, and yeah, thank you again to them. But let's dive into it. We had two big events. The very first event in Europe, which was the Dortmund Regional Championships. So why don't we go ahead and go over that first?
Yeah, I think Dortmund was a really good snapshot of where the meta has moved since the Baltimore Regional Championships. I think the main takeaway I had from this event was just the rise of Sneasler and Dragapult balance teams. These teams were everywhere throughout the top 16, basically. It was really interesting because I actually think the first place and second place teams were, obviously not Sneasler Dragapult balance, and so we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But in general, like, these teams were just everywhere, and I thought that this kind of composition had underperformed a little bit at Baltimore Regionals. It finished as high as third place with a variant with Electabuzz. Magmar now has become really popular on these variants as well, especially thanks to access to Will-O-Wisp as well as Overheat. The water type, we have actually seen Solo Dondozo being used as well. But yeah, this composition is just everywhere, and I don't think it's going to go anywhere anytime soon. And then I thought the top two teams were really cool as well, especially the first place team. Tailwind, I think, has generally been a little bit underrepresented so far in the open team sheet best of 3 tournaments. And so for it to win the second major, I thought was neat. And there were a lot of cool tricks on this team, like Fire Terra Hydreigon with choice specs, as well as Misty Terrain Clefable.
Yeah, this event, I mean, there was probably a lot we saw at the Baltimore Regional Championship where everyone was trying to figure out, there was so many different diversity, and now we're kind of focusing on this more centralization, as you said before, around the balance teams that Europe is very more comfortable with. It was interesting to see like how much of the Sneasler Dragapult teams, as you said before, were very common at this event. And I thought what was interesting is there was like no Dondozo Tatsugiri combinations in the top 32. I think the highest one was literally 33rd place.
Yeah.
And literally there were 2 solo dozos that outperformed that composition. So interesting to see. We have definitely seen, I think, a bit of more increase in those balance teams, less of Dondozo stuff, maybe a bit less of size spam as well. I think there's only like one size spam team in the top 32. We saw some of like the teams we saw at Baltimore perform, like the Vivillon team, but didn't perform nearly as well. And yeah, we also saw like some screens, which was actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, there were a couple of screens users, and I think in general, we're at a place in the meta now where if we're trending towards balance, I feel like screens can have a lot more impact. Setting something like Reflect, Light Screen can really help out to make sure that you are going to have more turns in the game, as long as you don't get crit. But it's also really nice against some of these more setup teams that we have in the top 32, still looking at something like Population Bomb or Beat Up into Archaludon and Annihilate, as well as a couple of other setup options. I know this is a part of more of like the balance teams, but we still have Black Glasses, Sword Stance, King Gambit, which I think is also something that I would consider to be a part of that sphere.
Yeah, definitely. I think at this point it feels like, coming out of Baltimore Regionals, the established archetypes that did really well there were obviously Rain, which won the entire thing, as well as the Porygon 2 Ursaluna teams. I think like those were everywhere coming out of Baltimore Regionals. So both of those were still represented in the top 8 of this tournament, with Porygon 2 Ursaluna finishing as high as 4th place and Rain finishing in 5th place. You guys were talking about screens, and Grimmsnarl was on this version of the Rain team that performed super well, piloted by Fevzi. A bunch of the other top German players brought us to the tournament, and were finished in the top 16 and top 32 as well with it. And so I think like those archetypes already established. I think Dragapult balance now kind of gets added to the mix after kind of being underrepresented at Baltimore Regionals. And then we didn't see it as much in this tournament in particular, but the team that Paul Chua used to get second at Baltimore Regionals, I think, is still very popular. And there was another tournament over in Brazil the same weekend, and it finished in 1st and 2nd place. That team having Incineroar, Dragonite, Amoonguss, King Gambit, Garchomp, as well as Alolan Ninetales. And so right now it feels like these are kind of the go-to teams that a lot of top players have ended up on. But I think there is still, like, I'm curious about like Size Spam and Dondozo, right? These are like big threats that previously existed in other Scarlet and Violet VGC formats, and they definitely feel a little underrepresented in the current moment.
Yeah, it feels hard, I think, for Dondozo. Clear Smog Amoonguss just makes it so difficult. especially being one of the more common teams, like the one that Paul used did have Clear Smug on the Amoonguss, which just makes it so difficult. You could run Terra Steel safety goggles on Dundozo, but then it's like worse into a lot more general matchups, so it's a lot more difficult to run, I think. Size spam is kind of interesting. I think it's Rillaboom being one of the most common Pokemon in the format. Like, even the balanced team of Rillaboom, King Gambit can give size spam a lot of trouble because Gyarados Grassy Terrain, a Swords Dance setup with Terra Dark Sucker Punch that can just like blow up the Trick Room user. It can do a lot before like they can move in Trick Room, which makes it really awkward. I think the balanced team that Paul used again to get second place at Baltimore, yeah, that team was originally created by Gabriel Gotti, who's actually the winner of the Joinville Regional Championship, who worked with Paul actually and gave him the team for Baltimore. And him, Sebastian, and Gabriel ended up having very high success. Actually, like the finalists were literally a mirror, so it's interesting. The only difference is Gabriel ended up going with a more offensive approach, switching to a choice band Garchomp instead of the Life Orb and choice specs on the Ninetales, which I thought was really interesting there.
Yeah, I was looking at those items too, and I thought it was really cool to see the adaptations within the team of 6. And I feel like we might end up seeing that a lot, especially when we look at a lot of these balanced teams that are going to contain a lot of the same pieces. It's going to come down to a lot of those individual choices. Like, I remember being really impressed. Aaron, remember when you and I were actually casting Dawei at the Baltimore Regional Championships? I feel like that was a great example of somebody who had taken a lot of like the key pieces we would have expected to see successful in the meta, and then just give those little tweaks to make it extra special to really take on that tournament.
Yeah, totally. I thought like that team was really interesting from Baltimore because it was like, it felt like everyone had figured out Porygon 2 Ursaluna and was like, this is like the best version of it. And then Dawei was like, well, I've got some other tricks, like adding a Grimmsnarl to the mix, for example, like having Struggle Bug, Covert Cloak, Volcarona, which like absolutely dominated on stream in top 16 as well. And so, yeah, I'm curious to see where Grimmsnarl goes from here. Like, I thought it was a little bit underplayed in general, but I think one of the interesting things about Grimmsnarl is it's not really doing very much damage, right? And so like we have been used to seeing Grimmsnarl in actually like the restricted formats, because the idea is to just like make your restricted Pokemon even more difficult to knock out. But in a format where like the power level is maybe a little bit more balanced, if you're bringing Grimmsnarl, means that you have to rely on like the other 3 Pokemon to do a lot of damage. And so, but I think it's clear like Grimmsnarl, you know, has gotten top 8 at both Baltimore as well as Dortmund regionals, and so clearly a very viable Pokemon. I think one of the other interesting things about comparing Dortmund to Baltimore is like Baltimore had some like really crazy teams, like totally off the wall Pokemon that were just like I would have never expected. There were still some of those at Dortmund, like Jack Clark finishing in top 8 with what was probably one of the craziest teams I've seen in this format right now. Like, nothing on this team was really standard. You had Komoa with Iron Defense, Flamethrower, Body Press, Driftbloom plus Indeedee as a combination, Choice Specs, Normal, Toxtricity, Life Orb, Volcarona, Assault Vest, Hydreigon. Like, that was definitely the standout team for me, because it was just like, this is a team I would have, you know, it really came out of nowhere, and there's so many cool Pokemon here. And then we had some individual one-ups that I thought were interesting. Like, there were a bunch of other Komoas actually in day 2 of the tournament. We're talking about Size Spam. Delphox has definitely quickly risen to become a viable Pokemon in the format, giving you a faster Pokemon that can use Expanding Force, you know, paired with Indeedee, of course. And then you had some Kilowattrons in 34th and 35th place, which I thought was really cool as well. But definitely like less kind of crazy team building that we saw from Baltimore. And I think that makes sense because Baltimore was like a new meta, completely unestablished, and now we're moving to a meta that at least like has more tournament results now at this point.
I do want to raise one Pokemon that I don't know if either of you would have expected to see in day 2 of Dortmund, and that was a weakness policy to Dudunsparce.
Yeah. Finished in 71st place, and I think it might have been a idea that Paul Ruiz had initially constructed, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, like this format, even though it's becoming more centralized, we still are going to see the techs, I think, because there are a lot more viable Pokemon. I think it was really interesting to see the Kilowattrol adjustment on the Weezing stuff. There was actually like 2. Like, there was the one that Wolf brought to Baltimore with the Toedscruel combined with the competitive Kilowattrol, which I thought was cool. And then the next one was an Ability Shield Incineroar, which we've seen paired with Weezing before, but I thought it was just a really interesting take. It featured Gallade. As we see, like, there are still room to innovate in this format. I'm pretty interested, though. We had this conversation in the last episode with Baltimore, where we were comparing Regulation G stats to Regulation H and how it wasn't as diversified as we thought it might be. Do you think we're going to see more diversification, or do you think we're going to see less diversification by the end of Regulation H as Regulation G?
I think it depends on the region. I do think it's region dependent. I think that North America is always going to come out with the more spicy teams or maybe the more interesting picks. I think there's fewer players that opt to go for choices like that in Europe. And as we've seen across the board for most of their events, they always tend to stick to things that they think are a little bit more standard. I've even seen people in Europe complain about this format because there's too many things that are sort of off the wall or maybe a bit more surprising that makes them not like the meta nearly as much. But then I think you look at LATAM that kind of is like meets it in the middle between what we might expect to be more crazy in North America, more standard in Europe.
You mean bring back Urshifu?
Oh, don't bring that back. Oh, please don't bring back Urshifu. Nobody wants that.
I've seen so many tweets asking for bringing back
Yeah,
Urshifu.
I know. I don't know why Europe wants that so bad.
I think it's a good question, James. My guess is it will have more variety than Reg G, but I think like my takeaway the last time we talked about this was there was actually probably a little bit more variety in G than we had actually even like given credit for. But I do think like this still feels like the format where there is still a lot of stuff that's like undiscovered, and like we've been playing the meta officially for what, just over a month now, and so like I think like there is still a lot of interesting stuff that can be cooked up, and some of it might be safe for LAIC. I think LAIC will be really fun to watch. I think it'll probably be the most competitive LAIC just because like so many people are playing the game now. So many people are going to fly over for the event as well. So I think just by attendance number as well as like number of really high level players going, I think it should be awesome to watch. But yeah, it's a good question because right now it does feel like there are just a couple of team comps that really stand way above the rest. And I'm curious to see like where things go, right? Like Dondozo is one that I keep talking about because it's still getting like top 8, top 16 here and there. And like it didn't do super well over in Dortmund, but at Joinville and Baltimore, there was at least one Dondozo team, I think, in the top 8. So I think it's still like totally relevant. I'm just curious like where innovation goes with it, because I think there's a lot that can be done with Dondozo, and most of the Dozo teams we've seen have looked very similar to how people have been using Dozo previously. But to your point, yeah, Clear Smog Amogus is everywhere. And so like you would probably need something like Steel Terra Dondozo just to like counter that, for example. I
do think that I think this format does have a lot of room for innovation. I think the problem is trying to master something in a quick time span, because it feels like there's too many events in a short condensed period, and that's kind of the things that are problematic with regulations, especially like short ones, where this format has so many diversified things, but we already know like what has really good stats, what's pretty consistent across the board. We can't really explore too much. I think after like, this is my experience from I was pre-bulking recordings for before I travel a bit, and I've been trying out a lot of the teams that have been doing really well on the ranked ladder from Japan, and they've come up with some crazy stuff. I had a lot of fun with like a Polyrath Weavile Rain team, which actually felt really good, and I would actually like, I still on the fence. Maybe I'll bring an edited version to Louisville if I do decide if I need a team, because that team was actually like one of the most fun teams I played. I played a Executor Sun team with Ninetales that I finished in the top 100 last season. There's been so many fun Pokemon that I think are really cool to explore and actually are competitively viable and can do really well if given the time. But I just don't feel like players have as much time to really build, because when we think about it, LIC is literally the biggest event of the season, only a month away, which isn't that much time. So I'm kind of curious what would have happened if we had a bit of a longer time period where players could have actually explored a bit more, because I think that's going to be the issue. Is I think this format has a lot more diversity than what it's currently shown. It's just we do not have much time in this format.
I think a lot of events are very front loaded for the season. Like I mean the fact that we've already had 4 including the Lima special event last weekend, I think is saying something. We've got Louisville that's coming up this weekend. We've got the Lille Regional that's going to be right after that, the weekend after. And then we also have the Gdansk Regional 2 weeks after that point, a Buenos Aires special event, all leading up to the Latin America International Championships. I don't remember last season being like that in terms of just how many events we smushed into a small period.
Especially because we only have a few months in each regulation. I guess it just depends on like when we think about, because we had Reg A that was only like 2 events. Then we had Reg B, which felt like a decent chunk. Reg C felt kind of the same as Reg B, so it didn't really differ. Reg D and Reg E kind of felt similar. Reg F was a bit different, and then Reg G, like I think it's going to be interesting when we come back, because maybe we'll get a bit more diversification, because maybe we'll get to explore a bit more, but I can't really say, because we did have a world championship in that format towards the end of it, so hard to say if we'll actually see more innovation or if people will just stick with the teams they tried to master for worlds before.
Totally, yeah. But, I thought the team that actually won Dortmund Regionals was pretty innovative. Like, it's not like it used any crazy Pokemon, but Whimsicott in itself, I actually thought was, like, dramatically underplayed. Clefable, really cool as a redirection user with that Misty Terrain tech, which you can use for so many different things, right? Like getting rid of grassy terrain and psychic terrain, of course, giving you immunity to Spore. Although most of that team actually already was very well matched into Spore. You can also do it to set up, yeah, exactly, so that Ursaluna doesn't get burnt by Flame Orb. And so, yeah, I think like this was a really smart team. And it's funny, when I saw it, I'm like, oh, cool, Whimsicott and Annihilate, I'm sure has beat up. And the Whimsicott didn't even have beat up. Like, but the safety goggles, like Bulk Up, Drain Punch, Rage Fist, and Annihilate set has been somewhat popular. And the idea is that it can just stay on the field for a long time, set up, especially when you have redirection support from Clefable. And then, yeah, the combo of like Sunny Day Whimsicott with Fire, Terra, Specs, Hydreigon is no joke. Like, I've gotten destroyed by that before. And like, it makes Hydreigon just feel like a Charizard, and then when you have Levitate as your ability as well, you don't have to worry about getting hit by ground type damage. And so I thought it was cool, because it wasn't like it's not like, oh, these pieces or these Pokemon came out of nowhere, but it's not like these 6 were actually really popular like going into Dortmund regionals. And so right now it's basically like, here are a couple of teams that are really popular, so are you able to find something that has like a good matchup into those, as well as like you still need to be prepared for Dondozo and Psy Spam, because it's like, even if these teams aren't making it super deep in a tournament, you're probably pretty likely to run into, some of those like day one of a tournament in the earlier rounds. And it feels really bad when you're like, oh, I'm not going to like tech for Dondozo, and then you lose to Dondozo in round 1. You're like, okay, well.
Quick way to get your tournament off on the wrong foot for sure. But I kind of wonder if maybe that's a good segue point to talk about some of the more unique things that we ended up seeing at the Joinville Regional Championships too. Because I know we touched on the fact that Gabriel Legati and Sebastian Escalante got first and second with the Paul Chua team, or as James corrected, it's actually the Agati team that Paul Chua used. So I'm glad we're able to get that straight. But there were a couple of other things that were in this like top 17 top cut that I thought were pretty unique. I think Blumora, what do you guys think of that Pokemon? I feel like we've seen it on and off, but when we were seeing it, it was also always on a lot of Tailwind teams, but I still think there's a really good place in it for poison type damage and rock type damage.
I think Lamora is really good as a mon. It's just awkward, I think, mainly because it's obviously one of the best partners with Dozo, because you can stall out with the toxic debris in certain cases. I think it's really powerful there. I think the problem is it's not picking up knockouts as quickly. I still Sneasler, being one of the fastest poison types, is also really nice, offers really good coverage there. Its speed tier, Glamour, is interesting because it's faster than Golden Go by 1 point, but otherwise it's still like kind of like a mid-tier speed, I think, in this format. Poison doesn't seem as important when Amoonguss and Sneasler are actually pretty common, so you can get rid of the toxic spikes by just switching into those. So one of Glamora's biggest strengths can be just neutralized immediately. So I think it's a lot harder to use. I have tried out Glamora in this format. I think it's still pretty decent, but it does really need the right team composition. I think speed control is really nice. We see that it paired with the Talonflame on the Dondozo teams like we see in this one. And overall, I think it's a good mod. It's hard to use. And like, I think the most powerful set is the Power Herb Meteor Beam set. And you know how inconsistent Meteor Beam can be, especially if you need to hit a bunch of those in the day one of a tournament. So yeah, I mean, it's a good mod. It's just kind of in a weird spot. Also, Golden Go does still threaten Glamour quite heavily.
Yeah, Garchomp is also everywhere right now, and I think like just like being weak to Earthquake and Stomping Tantrum and being slower than it makes you such a liability, so it becomes like a pretty big Terra hog as well. But Dragon types, I think in general, are just super dominant right now, and I think like Archaudon being another one that's popular. Like Lamora would have to Earth Power into it, but like you're often Assault vested, and then you just take a lot of damage in return. But makes a lot of sense on the Dondozo teams in particular. I'm curious to see where like Glamora fits on non-Dondozo teams. But yeah, I think to James's point, Poison being so common right now in Amoonguss and Sneasler alone means you get a lot less value out of those toxic spikes than you normally would.
That makes a lot of sense. I feel like I'm in the same boat where Glamora, as a cool Pokemon, especially seeing the dominance that it had in the earlier days of Scarlet and Violet, I'm like, where's that Pokemon? It's kind of like, where's the Palafin? We have no idea where Palafin is. He's hiding. Maybe not going to come out the rest of the format. I'm not sure. But I also think going back to Dragon types, the thing that really stuck out to me about Joinville in particular is that double dragon on a lot of these teams was really popular. Outside of the Palchua team or the Gabriella Gotti team that has the Garchomp and the Dragonite, there were also quite a different number of combinations when it came down to the two dragon types that you would have on the team together. I think there was another one that was Dragapult and Hydreigon, but you also have the Archaludon and Garchomp. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts about, is Double Dragon something that can stay, especially when maybe we're starting to see a level of Ninetales, and I even saw Frostmoth in day 2 of Dortmund, but those are creeping up in popularity.
Yeah, I mean, I think Double Dragon's always been a popular pick. I think since like what, old school VGC back in 2013, 2014. And that was when we got fairy types, and that didn't stop it. And with the less amount of fairy types in the format, I still think it's really strong. Even with Alolan Ninetales, I do think it's actually in a really good position right now because of its fast B tier choice specs. I think is really smart. Like a lot of the Japanese players end up doing a team tournament online, and like Zine, the world champion from 2023, ended up using it, or using the same team as like Gabriel Gotti. He ended up using Terra Ghost on the Alolan Ninetales, but a lot of those players have been really liking that team. And Alolan Ninetales is still like kind of weak though. Like choice specs really helps the damage output, but it still misses a lot of knockouts. So I do think that you can get away with Double Dragon still, and a lot of the time your Terra flying with the Dragonite, because I think flying coverage is just really good. Dragonite's been really consistent as a way to get rid of Sneasler, especially with Lumberry, because you could go for the Terra Blast into extreme speed most of the cases and don't have to worry about like Dire Claw screwing you up. Multi-Scale is also just a fantastic ability. I'm kind of curious if Inner Focus will come back, because Incineroar is picking up more in usage. But I do think Double Dragon is just going to always be strong with like less fairies. Ice coverage isn't as important or as dominant as like the Xian Pao era when we had Xian Pao, because Alolan Ninetales is still picked, but it's not like, oh, it's like on every team. It's a common pick, but it's not like, oh, it's not even that high in usage. I think we'll see it increase, but I don't think it's that crazy for now.
Yeah, I think the dragons just inherently are so good. Like the ones that are popular just all do so much damage. There's a lot of flexibility between using special dragons versus physical dragons, and so it's like, I think because Terra exists, you can get away with using 2 on a team a lot easier. Just because it's like, oh, like all I have to do is Terra 1, as long as I don't have like, both of them on the field without Terra, then I should be okay, right? And like without Flutter Mane existing as well, you don't have to worry about fairy types just in general, or offensive fairy types nearly as much. One cool dragon that popped up in Joinville was Baxcalibur, which has been kind of underused, and it finished in 3rd place on Juan Salerno's team. I also, by the way, with Dragonite, it's interesting because this Baxcalibur was loaded dice with Scale Shot, and I feel like I've seen Scale Shot loaded dice everywhere on ladder in best of 1, but it's like barely made a dent on Dragonite in open team sheet best of 3 events. And so I'm curious if that Dragonite set pops up a little bit more, because right now it's been very much about like the Terra Blast Lumberry set like James was just talking about. So that's one thing I'm curious about. And then one other thing from Juan's team I thought was cool was coaching on Sneasler. I feel like I've seen so many coaching users this format between Sneasler as well as Blaziken and Annihilate, that I think that it's just one of the most viable formats for this move, because it's a lot easier to use, especially when you have it on fast Pokemon like Sneasler and Blaziken after a speed boost.
Yeah, this one was really cool because it was also unburdened. So let's say Sneasler gets an attack off with something like the Dire Claw, the close combat, the Focus Sash is gone, and then all of a sudden, Sneasler's probably the fastest thing on the field too. So the last Hail Mary that the Sneasler can provide into the game could sometimes be that coaching for something like the King Gambit or the Baxcalibur. So I thought that was really cool. And to the Baxcalibur note, I feel like just priority Ice Shard feels so good to have in a lot of these games and a lot of these matches, just looking at the teams that exist. So I'm interested to see if Baxcalibur does pick up a little more on that front too.
Yeah, having a way to break through to multi-skill and Dragonite's nice. I think coaching's a really cool option on Sneasler. We didn't really get to talk about it, but the 2nd place team by Maddie Moo at Dortmund Regionals did actually feature the coaching Sneasler, and it actually was a Terra Flying set. So what he often did was go for the Terra Flying with the Sneasler next to the Garchomp, where he could go for the coaching, get the +1 attack and defense, and then fire off an Earthquake. And it can be really strong, especially since his variant was a clear amulet set. So it might not be getting like the immediate knockouts like a Life Orb +1 would. But the fact is, you can intimidate the Garchomp, slow it down with like an Icy Wind. Could make a huge difference in allowing Garchomp to just stick around on the field and just dish out really strong, consistent damage. So I think coaching's a really interesting move. Fake Out, of course, is really strong. Like Caesar just has a bunch of good moves that it can run Swords Dance, Acrobatics. There's so many, like even Throat Chop coverage I've seen on ladder. I think the Scale Shot Dragonite is interesting because I do think it's more of a team we see in the East compared to the West, and it did do well when it was available. I do remember, what was it, the Gouging Fire team at EUIC, the farthest one with Dragonite.
Top 8, I think, yeah.
Featured that Scale Shot variant. I'm pretty sure Scale Shot Dragonite did well at Worlds, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong on that note, but I do think Scale Shot Dragonite is pretty strong. The only thing is, of course, you are kind of inconsistent with accuracy on Scale Shot, which is the only downside. And depending on its moveset, like, you are running Scale Shot, and then like what are the rest of the moves? Like, you kind of want a few moves like Haze sometimes for Dundozo, maybe like Low Kick, Extreme Speed, but Terra Flying as well. Like, there's so many moves you can run, but you're usually stuck to that loaded dice as the item, which is the only downside, which is an upside and downside. But of course, loaded dice, you could get knocked off. You could just miss the move and it's irrelevant. You don't have that Lumberry as we've seen previously, or the Assault Vest that could help out with longevity for Dragonite. It's just an item preference, I think, at the end of the day. But I do think the set is actually still pretty good.
Totally. Yeah. I think we're in an interesting place now where we still have a lot of events in this format, but to your guys' points, like, these events are happening really quickly. And so James, I thought your point earlier was really good, where like there just isn't enough time to like cook for a lot of people, and so they would rather stick with something that's already been like tested and maybe like adapted a little bit. But if you look at Dortmund, it's like, yeah, most of the teams are standard, but here's Jack Clark using something that's like completely crazy, right? So it's like there's so much room for these Pokemon and strategies to work, but like you have to feel really confident in them because there's such a wide matchup spread in this format. But I am really curious to see like, you know, what this leads to, especially as we have a couple of more regionals leading up to LAIC, which of course is going to take place in mid-November. And so I'm curious what Pokemon or strategies you think might still be a little bit underrepresented or could be good right now, given where the meta is.
I'm kind of surprised that Rain dropped off a bit. So that's a big one, because we saw Rain do really well at Baltimore, but I don't think it did. Like, we did see the Screens team, like the one that Ethan brought to Baltimore, do well with like Fevzi and a few other German players, but otherwise, like, Rain wasn't really heavily represented, I think, in Dortmund, which I kind of thought surprising because I think Pelipper or Caledon's still really strong. I do think Golden Go builds still have a way to go. Like, Golden Go still has done well at the tournament in general. Like, they were literally both in finals, but I do think that there's a lot more innovation for those builds. Vivillon, I think, needs a different build, because I think Vivillion's still really strong, but I do think the team is maybe a little bit outdated, as we saw at Dortmund. Like, they still performed pretty well, but kind of fell off the mark for getting into that top 8. And then there's just so many, I think, again, unexplored mods that I think can do really well, like Dendoza, as you said before. I do think that there are a few ways I could see it moving on. I don't want to spread that up because I don't want to face Dundozo as much at events. So good luck to the Dundoza builders out there. Not my problem, but yeah, I do think that there's so much innovation. Anything can really go. And I just think it's just going to come down to, do people actually want to spend the time and learn as quickly as possibly, or just stick to the comfort stuff that's already been proven, tested to be good?
For me, I hope that Sand might actually be able to break into some of the better teams in the format. I feel like Tyranitar has always been around, but where's like Tyranitar, Corviknight, Garchomp? Like, where's Len actually? Can we get Len Duel to make a competent Tyranitar Garchomp team? Because I think there's so much exploration there. I know part of the reason why Tyranitar maybe is harder to maneuver is because Sneasler exists, and also a ton of Intimidate users. I think it makes Tyranitar's damage output feel a little bit muted, but Tyranitar, please, somebody make Tyranitar good again.
I think it's definitely possible. Sand was actually one of my answers as well. Like, I think it's just been a little bit underplayed. We did see it in top 32 over here at Dortmund, and that was with T-Tar and Excadrill. Corviknight also a really good call out. I think that's another Pokemon that has felt really strong when I've tried it out. It's interesting because Dortmund, it was like one of the biggest rises in Pokemon that like really did well in this tournament was Magmar. So as a you don't want to go up against Magmar when you're Corviknight because you're just going to get overheated and Will-O-Wisp. But if Magmar usage like starts decreasing a little bit, maybe there's room for Corviknight to thrive a little bit more. I'm personally still really interested in Sinistcha. Like, I think, we've seen it a little bit here and there, but its ability is just so good. I think there's so much that you can do with it. So that's a Pokemon I have my eye out on. And, Rose, earlier you were talking about Double Dragons. I was like, hey, where's Sylveon? Like, where are the fairy types? Because Primarina is everywhere as a fairy type. Alola Ninetales and Clefable are getting some usage as well. But I wonder if, like, there is room for more fairies to be used, especially with the prevalence of all the dragon types. And so, yeah. Those are a couple I'm curious about. But yeah, I mean, T-Tar Lycanroc was very good for a couple of formats, even if it was mainly piloted by just one player, but one player who was able to get like top 16 at like 5 different regionals in different formats with it. And so, yeah, I'm very curious about Sand. I think one of the other cool things about Sand is Sneasler. It feels like so many people are using Focus Sash right now. So being able to like break that Focus Sash through Sand naturally is really nice. And, as Sneasler, I think Sneasler definitely had become like public enemy number 1 after Dortmund regionals because it was like everyone was using it. It was getting a lot of crazy RNG on stream as well. So I think people will probably think a little bit more about like other ways to beat Sneasler, right? Like naturally, ghost type Pokemon can be pretty tough. That's why, Annihilate, for example, is something that people have been going back towards using. And so, yeah, just a couple of thoughts, but definitely agree with what you guys have said. And I'm just hoping we get to see some more like really cool spice being cooked up. But, even though Dortmund, for the most part, had like a lot of things you would expect, like I'd say both the first place team, Maddie using the Sneasler Garchomp combo as well as Jack in the top 8, having that crazy Drifloon team, all just really neat stuff that I think, pushes things forward a little bit.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. I think one thing we did actually forget to talk about, which I want to bring up, was there were so many redirection users actually at this Dortmund Regional Championship.
Yeah.
I remember there was an absurd stat, but I can't remember like how many teams used Follow Me or some kind of redirection, but it was a lot of the teams in the day 2.
I think it was 31 out of 32 in top 32.
I want to say it was like 30, 31 out of 32. I do think you're correct on that. But yeah, like it's absolutely insane. We are seeing so many redirections mons between Mousehold, Clefable, Amoonguss, Electabuzz, Magmar coming up. Like who would have thought like this would have been a format with Magmar and Electabuzz? You know what the Pokemon that needed Follow Me back was? I miss Follow Me Blastoise from like Gen 5. Gen 5 was really fun, Follow Me Blastoise. Japanese event only. But do you think we're still going to see, like, who do you think at the end will be the premier Follow Me mon? Because Clefable did drop a lot in usage compared to, I think, Baltimore for this event. We saw more Magmar. We saw more Electabuzz. Moongus, I think, kind of stayed the same. I think Sinistcha still has a lot of potential, as you said before. But it's kind of curious because there's so much redirection in this format with how strong it can be for the setup mod. So do you think that we're going to see as much redirection? Do you think we're going to see someone take over with Electabuzz, Magmar? Clefable did win this event, so do you think it comes back in usage? Or do you think that there's something else?
I think they're all just good. So it like comes down to the team and like the purpose of the redirection user. If I had to bet on one, I think I'd probably pick Amoonguss just because it's like one of the GOAT, maybe the GOAT redirection user in VGC, but it's also a little bit easier countered when Magmar and Electabuzz are in the format, right? And like safety goggles exists. And so, yeah, but I don't know. Like 2 Amoonguss is in the top 4 here. Even with all the counterplay in the that exists, I think it still has a lot of viability. But it's a good question, James. Yeah, it's like, I could see every redirection user that you listed like winning a tournament this season. Like that's how good all of them are. And there's like, if they all serve very different roles depending on what you're looking for, right? Like Amoonguss, a little bit more valuable for its bulk, its ability to function under Trick Room, its ability to clear smog. Magmar and Electabuzz, interesting. Like Magmar can actually deal decent offense with Overheat. Electabuzz can drop speed with Electroweb and also go for Thunderbolt, which is valuable into Rain. Clefable, valuable for its fairy typing as well as Unaware. So it's like all of these are really good. It just kind of depends on the team. But yeah, if you made me have to pick one, I think I would just pick Amoonguss because it's like it's just always been so good and consistent. And even in a format where there's a lot of counterplay to it, it's still performing well.
Electiva's believer. Just for the reason that you mentioned, I think that having the speed control is just so valuable, especially when a lot of the Pokemon in the format also kind of play at pretty similar speed tiers. So I feel like one Electro Web drop is so valuable. I know it can miss, but we're just going to ignore that part.
Trust me, as someone who ran Electroweb, Thunderwave, Electabuzz for Worlds, yeah, having to hit all of those can definitely stink at times. But I do think that it's pretty interesting. Clefairy is one that we just haven't seen thanks to Clefable. Even though Friend Guard, I think, is really good, it's just really tough where Clefable's Unaware, I think, is way more valuable just right now with like the Saurus Dance King Gambits that are out there. And just with all the steel types, it's a bit harder, I think, to use Clefairy. But one mon, I think that could cook, which I'm surprised we haven't seen too much yet, but maybe we will if someone does. I'm surprised we haven't seen Smeargle yet in this format, because we usually see, I feel like there's some Smeargle strategy that we're not seeing in this regulation that could cook. And I'm not talking about the Smeargle muck. Let's not talk about that combo. But I feel like there's a legitimate use of Smeargle that could be used in this format for like really strong setup strategy. I've seen a few on ladder with like Water Shuriken, and you go for it into like Annihilate, which I thought was like cool. Or I think it's Water Shuriken. Maybe they went Searching Strikes. I've seen both actually. So I do think that there's other ways, but I do think Smeargle has a lot of potential, which I'm kind of curious if we'll ever see. But yeah, I think Redirection is just really good.
It's funny because it's like Smeargle and Clef were so relevant in Reg G, but it's interesting because it's like when you play a format like Reg G where like you can go all in on like setting up your Calyrex Shadow Rider, for example, then support Pokemon that can't even do any damage are more strong, I think, versus a format where we're talking about earlier, like the power level is kind of more neutralized or like even across the board. I definitely agree with you though, James. Like Smeargle is just such a flexible Pokemon. You can do infinite things with it, and we just need some crazy, team builder to be in the kitchen and cook something wild. But I've definitely lost against it. Like it's the worst Pokemon to play against in best of one ladder, because you usually have like, is it Choice Scarf? Is it Focus Sash? Like, what is it gonna do? Whereas at least an open team sheet, you get to know your opponent's moves, right? So that's like you don't have the element of surprise, which historically has been a really nice advantage for Smeargle. And then on Clef's point, I think, yeah, I definitely agreed with all of those. And I think like Clefable does really reasonable damage with Moonblast as well. And like Clefairy just is like a little bit weaker. And when people used it, it has like no offensive potential really. And like having a strong stab Moonblast in this format's really nice when there are all these dragon types. And so, but yeah, I think like I totally wouldn't be surprised if like both of those were on like a high performing team, but maybe just a little bit less flexible than the current redirection users, which, and there are already so many good ones that exist. But I also wonder if like Stalwart or Chaladon then picks up and uses this, because we've seen Stamina, we've seen, the Sturdy as well. And so I don't know if I feel like if there's any time for it to come out right now, it's maybe now when there's, every team has redirection. It'd be interesting.
I've already faced them on ladder, dude. There we
go.
I've already faced them on ladder. Japan likes it. And actually, I played a lot in the Global Challenge. Actually, that was what it was. And I only played like I played like 12 games in the Global Challenge, and I faced like 3 stalwarts, which was crazy. All of them were stalwart. I have no idea why, but yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this format goes. But we got Louisville. I have no idea if this video is going to be uploaded before Louisville. I'd imagine after. Any predictions to wrap things up?
Good question. I don't know. I don't expect Louisville to be too crazy. Like, it's happening so soon after these events. And so I would expect to mainly like the kind of, I think, top 4 team comps in my eyes coming out of these events are, you have your the classic Porygon 2 teams, normally with Ursaluna, although now you have variants with Garchomp as well, as we saw Maddie finish in second place with. You have the Dragapult balance teams with redirection users like Magmar and Electabuzz. You have the Agati team that has done very well. You have Rain as well. And Rain can be flexible, whether you want to play more defensively with like, Grimmsnarl, as well as the Sinistcha, whether you want to go with more offense, like the Basket Legion, which we saw won Baltimore Regionals. I think the first place team from Dortmund definitely want to respect, kind of puts Tailwind back on the radar. And then you have to kind of cover still for like Sai Spam, both Trick Room and Tailwind. And then there's like, Dondozo Tatsugiri will still be around. Hard Trick Room, normally with Sai Spam, but Hard Trick Room in general is still a thing. those kind of feel like the main established compositions that exist to me right now. And then like those are the teams that you definitely want to prepare for going into an event. So I don't know. I'm curious to see, because it's like the Tailwind team that won this tournament wasn't actually really on my radar coming into this event. And so that in itself like has now established itself as a new strong archetype. But I think like there's just so much power between all of these that I'm curious if people will actually be able to come up with something completely new that like really deviates from the existing ones. My bet would be not really. Maybe one or two teams in like top 16 in Louisville. For the most part, I would expect it to represent most of those comps that I was just talking about.
Gastrodon. It's not a comp, but Pokemon that I am thinking could be explored a little more. I know that we did see one Salerno get third place with it at Joinville, but it's coming. I just know. I've been playing with this Pokemon in the format since day number 1, and it's good. It's just a little slow.
I mean, I do think it's good. It is good into rain comps, especially. For me, I kind of agree with Aaron's take. Although I think Louisville is actually bigger than Baltimore, if I'm not mistaken, on attendance numbers. So when we have these big events, there's always going to be surprises. Yep. I have no clue of what will happen at that event, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see like a pretty like reasonable top 8 where like most of the comps we've already seen. I wouldn't be surprised if we see like a few crazy teams. But it's literally, we'll see in Louisville, I suppose, in a couple days. Or by this time, you probably already know the Louisville results, and we'll cover those in a future episode.
Any final thoughts?
No, that's it. Eager to see where the format goes. It's always fun to do these with you. So thank you both for joining today. And yeah, I think, I don't know, it's still a really fun format. And James, when you were talking earlier, I was like, man, it's such a shame we don't get to play at Worlds in this format. Like, it's so crazy. We just get 3 months of it, and then we go back to Reg G. So I wish we had more time with it, but we'll just have to make the most out of what we have.
Yeah, imagine a world where they extended this past, instead of they take back, hey, we're going back to Reg G, is no, we're extending Reg H. Would be a pretty interesting announcement, which I don't think they're going to do. I just hope they don't do that. We're bringing back Reg H at the, like, I don't know, after Worlds, if we have to play in this format, because I don't know, bringing back regulations I always think is kind of strange, but at least make it somewhat different. But we'll see.
At least it's a good segue though, from like no paradox or restricted, and then you've got one with all the paradox, and then we're probably heading towards a double restricted format for Worlds. So there's like a good power level progression, I think, for people, especially if they're getting into VGC for the first time. But thank you all so much for joining us. This has been the Beastcoast Pokemon channel with myself, Aaron, and James, and we are so happy that you are here to listen to this, and we'll see you all in the next video.